Thank you so much for your time. My name is Dr. Skylar Walks. I am representative of the Calaboose African American History Museum in San Marcos, Texas, where I have served with our board of directors for several years now, and I'm currently serving as the Director of Educational Programming and the Vice President of our board. It brings me great pleasure to introduce an esteemed colleague of mine who's most humble and modest, so he's probably mortified that I introduced him with what he feels is a hyperbolic introduction, but I can assure you it's absolutely deserved. And I'd like to begin our conversation by sharing that we have with us, as part of our virtual talk series, the founding chair and former chair, but the founding chair, who, as well as an associate professor of the African and African Diaspora Studies at the University of Texas at Austin. Dr. Gordon is so much more than that, but again, I will not extend his introduction beyond that, but he's so much more. And one of the things that I must give light to, which really helps to contextualize our talk today, is his work around conceptualizing the racial geography tour at UT Austin, which has been such a critical piece for not only those who participate live, but even virtually, because it's now offered online as a virtual tour, to really understand the importance of place and space and the historicization around place and space. It's more relevant now, probably for a larger, more expansive audiences than it's ever been. But as someone who's had the opportunity to take it personally with Dr. Gordon as the docent and historian in that experience, I am one who learned an immense amount of information that I had no idea, that really helped me to better contextualize the university and also the marginalization that happened as an experience. So without further ado, I would like to welcome the incandescent Dr. Ted Gordon to our virtual talk today. Welcome, Dr. Gordon.
Well, thank you for having me, Skylar. Incandescent. I've been called a lot of things. I'm not sure I've ever been called that, but thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. It's a pleasure to be talking to you. Great.
I'm so glad you're here. One of the reasons why I really wanted to have you, and the museum really wanted to have you as a guest during our virtual talk series, is because for the first time, I think, at least for the first time in recent memory, I won't say for the first time ever, I think folks are paying attention, Dr. Gordon. They're paying attention to questions around identity. I think folks are self-interrogating in a way that they may not have done before. And beyond the self-interrogation around who I am, what I represent, the complexity of my identities, are also questions around the spaces in which we engage, the spaces that our buildings and our bodies occupy. And one of the things that you've so brilliantly done, apart from founding the African and African Diaspora Studies Department at UT Austin, is to create an experience, an immersive experience, where participants can literally walk the path of the racial geography history of that space, of the institutional space, which was inherited communal space. I don't even know if inherited is appropriate, maybe taken communal space. And so I'd love for you, if you would, to educate us about the process. What drove you to identify this as something that was needed? Beyond identifying the need, what motivated you to get it done, and how were you able to do all this? How were you able to put it together into a story that individuals could walk through?
Well, the truth of the matter is that in some sense, I don't really know. It's a process in the creation of something that didn't start out as a process to create anything. And what's been created has only recently, actually, in some sense, been identified as a thing. Now, that sounds like just a jumble of words, but it's literally what happened. I started when I first got here. I've always tried to engage in the politics of the local thinking about how it is that my politics in relationship to structures of power only really works in as much as I'm engaging the manifestations of unequal power where I stand or where I sit. And so I'm not from Texas. I'm from New York. I spent a lot of time in Central America immediately before I came to the campus of the University of Texas. And so when I got here, one of the first things I tried to do is figure out where I was. And in that process, it's a process of learning your environment, both your social and your physical environment, but also being engaged with other folks who are doing something similar, even folks who are doing something similar who've been here for a long time. So the racial geography tour really comes from some original encounters I had. I was asked by some young Black lower administrators in housing and food and housing to talk to some of the staff of food and housing. These are cafeteria line workers, maintenance people, people worked in the power plant and things like that about race at the University of Texas. Because it was something that no one really knew about. This we're talking about, way back when in 1990. That's actually now 30 years ago. I started out by trying to do some basic research in relationship to the data and the statistics and presented that, but also contextualized that in a kind of a slideshow with, a few pictures from around campus, because I wasn't used to having Confederate statues, and there were a lot of them on the UT campus. I wasn't used to that kind of stuff. So, I put a couple of those up. I kept getting invited back to give other kind of presentations on race on campus, and found that the visuals, particularly visuals of things that people encountered on an everyday basis, but hadn't really read consciously the racial content of, really were really important to people in terms of understanding, where they were in terms of the racial politics of the institution. So I did that, and then I had sometime in and around 2000, 2001, I had a friend who was also a friend come down, also from the North, and I was, we were talking about racism as Black folks do. And, I was saying, well, yeah, it's really shocking being down here in Texas, although, not that different in some ways from New York. And I said, well, we got all these Confederate statues out here. We got Confederate flags. And she said, what? And so I said, let me show you. And we went out, to see some of this stuff. And so whatever it was sort of began to keep growing between my conversations about both the kind of racism on campus and slideshows about that, plus Black agency on campus and slideshows about that. And when you're doing slideshows that kind of illustrate what you're talking about, you're always using some kind of visualization of space or persons, right? And then, there were so many spaces I began using in the slideshows that I just, decided it'd be nice to take people out to see these things. And over the years, over 20 years, maybe 25 years, it was just something I did. And I was doing it more and more as people asked me more about those things, to the point where, I don't even remember when I named it a racial geography tour, but at some point, probably within the last 10 years, maybe in the last 5 years, it got named that. And then people just kept asking me to do it. And finally, I had to have someone help me schedule them, because there were too many for me to keep track of. And then there were really too many for me to do. So that person, Ashley, I can't remember Ashley's last name right now. But anyway, she suggested, she was, at ads working with us, and she suggested I do a digital version of it, because I couldn't, do as many as I was being asked to do, and that's how the digitized thing got done. So it was, it's now a thing, but it certainly didn't start out as a thing. And, it's many things. And one of the things that makes me think about it is, all right, how scholarship works and how art works, because it is a performance piece as well. And I didn't start out for it to be that, but that is what it is. It's a pedagogical, research-based, annotated performance piece. So it's, and it just... That's
a mouthful. Let me make sure I get that. It's a pedagogical, resource-based performance piece, right?
Yeah. It's also, the digital thing has been described, and someone described it to me just the other day as an annotated research-based annotated documentary. That doesn't need I think actually he put the performative part in there too, but the performance aspect of it is important.
Yeah.
It's part of how the whole thing, and I certainly didn't start out that way and didn't even recognize that until
afterwards.
Yeah.
I think it's, I have to say, I don't disagree. I think, and again, I've experienced both the digital or the virtual experience and the physical experience. And I have to say that they're both incredibly engaging, but there is something, there are nuanced differences between the two. To your point, much like there would be, for example, watching Hamilton live on Broadway. This is probably one of the worst analogies that I could use, but watching Hamilton live on Broadway versus watching it on Disney Plus. Lawyers don't come after me. That was not a plug, but it's streaming on the Disney platform, right? So it's not that the content is different, but there are some levels of nuance that I think impact at a performative level how you experience what you're receiving, the content.
Yeah, it's at the performance level, with even more so for me. And I'm not sure if you're interested in pursuing this part of it, but one of the most, I thought naively that once we had the digital version of this, that no one would want to do the regular walking tour. But that's not been the case. And that has to do with, I think, two things. One is that the walking tour is much more interactive, and that has something to do with the way I teach. So on the walking tour, I rarely say that this is what that is. I often ask you, what is that? Because the way I teach and the way I do the tour, generally I assume that someone in the crowd has the piece of information that I'm looking for. And so my job as the teacher or the tour guide or the performer is to draw out of the crowd all the little pieces of information that people have and then put it together. And that way people they're participating in the sense that it's their knowledge. I'm just putting it together for them. Right now, there are some pieces that people don't have, and I'll throw that in there, but that's the give and take of that. So there's that. But even more than that, it's the live interaction with the environment. I've just been thinking about this recently. I'm fascinated by astronomy and by, the notion that by looking out into the heavens, you can not only sort of see your space, but you also see time, right? Mm. So if you know what you're looking at, you can see the beginnings of the universe, right? So you're not only seeing space, you're seeing time. And that's what the racial geography tour is about also. It's seeing the space as it's contemporarily kind of configured and its contemporary meaning, but by looking at it, you're also looking back in time, because those things were created back in time with those particular meanings. And so we're walking through and we're interpreting it and we're understanding these things in relationship to what's going on today, but we're also seeing what's back in time just by seeing or looking at space. So the space-time continuum is coming together in a very real way for folks. Now, we don't talk about that on the tour, but that's what's happening. And I think people find that to be very powerful, actually.
I absolutely agree. I think what happens when you have, there's three things that I'd like to know that I think happen when you're doing the racial geography tour in real time, if you will. One is you build, whether intentionally or not, you build community with the other participants. because you're able to frame knowledge and understanding based on the communal contributions of that knowledge and understanding. So that in and of itself ends up being a living piece to part of the conversation. The second part is what happens by the way that you facilitate the learning. And you're right, it's not at all didactic, right? And as a museum, one of the things that we try to work really hard around is not promoting a strictly didactic experience. And we train our docents and our junior docents to be as engaging as possible, to evoke critical thought and help scaffold that experience for patrons in the museum space, right? Which is essentially what you're doing with it. If you'll imagine, what has happened with the racial geography is the space and the time becomes an existential experience for participants. And what I mean by that is you are presently in the here and the now, but you are also at the same time having to interrogate what was when you were not in existence, right? You were not materially existent, but you have to interrogate what that was. You have to interrogate context. You have to interrogate sociocultural and political positionality. And you facilitate a consciousness around this, as do, at the same time, other participants within that learning community, which is a really unique thing. So it ends up being a museum outside, is what I felt.
It absolutely is. It's, and I think what it also points out the uniqueness, even though we don't necessarily consciously say that, of how we all are living both in the present and in the past.
Mm-hmm.
And that past continues to have a real impact on us. So we better understand it.
I would love for you to speak to that. We're all living both in the present and in the past. I think there would probably be some resistance. And I think what we're living in real time is the resistance to that somehow, because we are not currently living in the past, that we are not embodying the sociocultural and political ghosts of the past. And I've had conversations. We do diversity and inclusion work professionally and throughout the community. And what always comes up is how can folks now be made to be accountable for something that happened in the past? It's not anything that I participated in. I don't feel that it's appropriate for me to have to assume responsibility for that. And I think what you're speaking to when you say that we're living both simultaneously in the present and the past is not about attributing blame, but it's about contextualizing the present through the lens of the past and saying, this is how we arrived here. This is how you can understand what happened in this space, how this particular monument, statue, song was birthed in that context that we're singing today, even though we may not know where it came from, the history of it, that we're sitting and eating lunch on this monument, but may not know what it represents. So I would love for you to speak to why you think there's such a struggle and maybe even aversion to acknowledging the influence of the past on the present, and that we're living with both of those at the same time.
Well, I think why there's a resistance to it is pretty obvious, that people don't want to have to take responsibility for anything more than they minimally have to take responsibility for. And people who are in privileged positions absolutely don't want to have to take responsibility for the fact that they are privileged. In other words, that would mean that they'd have to interrogate their positionality and also interrogate their actions, right? So that's something, if you don't have to take responsibility for that, there's a difference between responsibility and blame, right? So I don't say that those folks who are alive today have to take the blame for what happened in the past, but you do have to take responsibility for whatever privilege you have, right? And the privilege that you have is, in a very real way, a product of the past, right? It's a product of the past in the present, right? So just like the buildings and the Confederate statues or the plinths that remain and all that were produced in the past, they're still with us in the present, right? So in that very same way, the structures of racism and patriarchy and this, that, and the other thing that were produced in the past have not disappeared. They're the scaffolding upon which much of what produces privilege in the present is built on. And so it's difficult for people. First of all, it's a little bit difficult because we're trained to only look at the surface, right? We're trained to think about the present as being innocent of the past, right? That the past is past and we're now innocent because even though that past might have been problematic, this is the innocent present. But we're also trained in such a way to think that, it's not our responsibilities to do anything about the ways in which the present is structured by the past, right? Because since it's not our fault, then we don't have to do anything about it. On the other hand, I'm not saying it's your fault, but I am saying that your privilege is a product of that. And so therefore we need to think about, all right, so how is it that we shift things up so that certain kinds of people aren't privileged, all right, from what happened in the past, and other folks aren't underprivileged or deprivileged or oppressed or whatever you want to call it based on that.
That's a really good point. And I think it speaks to, what is an innate desire to be absolved of responsibility, which is not synonymous with attributing blame, right? So you're not saying that we're attributing blame or anyone has to assume blame for something that they did not have a direct hand in constructing. However, the product of that is privilege, power and privilege, in the way that those work together to maintain a status quo, in which some folk have access for upward mobility, whatever that looks like, and some folks do not, or have it to a lesser degree. So
yeah.
what
I would say is that the issue of responsibility, so those who are privileged have a responsibility to represent, to recognize their privilege and work in some sense to negate that privilege. However, those who are not privileged also have certain responsibilities as well. In other words, our responsibilities is to engage in the struggles which will eliminate mastery in one way or another. So everybody has responsibilities, and this is just the responsibilities are slightly different. Plus, positionalities shift all the time. So in my positionality, I may be black, but on the other end be unprivileged because of my blackness, but I'm also light-skinned, and so I have light-skin privilege. I'm also a heterosexual male, so I have that kind of privilege. I'm also an older male, and so I have that kind of privilege. I'm also upper middle class, so I have that kind of privilege. So it's not that you sit there in your position of privilege and everybody else is, blaming you and is underprivileged in one way or another. These are cross-cutting means in terms of the way that power operates, and we all need to be cognizant of those things, and we need to be engaging from our own positionalities in terms of trying to undermine privilege.
I'm so glad to hear you say that, because there is a mutual responsibility, and it doesn't necessarily beget reciprocity either. I think that's the other thing. So I want to kind of speak to that a little bit more, because what I've also heard is that even from very well-intentioned folk who believe that they are somehow activating against marginality and the way in which privilege operationalizes to maintain power for some and a lesser degree of power for others. I've heard this from those who feel that they are activating in this way, are still somewhat hesitant to move the conversation further towards removing monuments or statues or even songs that have racist origins, because they fear that history will be lost, that we will somehow forget. What are your thoughts on that, as someone who has constructed and created an opportunity for folks to engage and interrogate space and place? Do you think that history becomes lost if the symbology is no longer there? The physical manifestation of that symbology is no longer there?
So my position on this is probably different than most people that you talk to. And my position is that something is lost, but what's lost by, for example, the University of Texas took down the Confederate statues that were on the South Wall. Right? 2017, the first ones were taken down. 2015, 2017, dead of night, they came and took them down. Okay, so the president actually called me up. I was on a plane the night before they started taking them down and said that they were going to take them down. And I said, fine, I support that, etc. But I had spent a number of years arguing for not taking them down. And what was my argument for not taking them down? My argument is that this whole thing, that these monuments represent Southern heritage and a way of life that needs to be remembered. That is an argument that's made by a lot of people who didn't want to take those statues down, is indicative of a certain kind of white nationalism that's very problematic. And that certain kind of white nationalism continues to exist. In fact, you can trace the history of it from the end of the Civil War through the whole lost cause ideology to the whole nationalist ideology that's created around World War I and Manifest Destiny, right up to today, where the country is split basically based on dueling notions of what the nation should be. And that whole kind of Southern nationalism has morphed into a white nationalist, U.S. nationalism, which is very much alive. Now, you take down the statues, and when I walk down that mall, I no longer have a daily reminder that the nation continues to be structured, at least in part, based on that nationalist ideology. And so what I think needs to happen with symbols like that is they need to be contextualized to tell that story and to signify what it is that these things actually believe. So what does it mean to have a statue of Robert E. Lee on your campus? Well, some folks would tell you, well, it's just, nostalgia for a particular kind of heritage, which was noble and this, that, and the other thing. And I'll tell you in that contextualization that what this was put up to do was to excuse the Southern side in the Civil War, right? And to construct a new kind of Southern nationalism, which wasn't really about slavery, but was anti-Black to its core, and that Southern nationalism has become part of a whole nationalist project that's very much alive, that's in power in Washington, D.C. I'll tell you that. And I will tell you that as you walk by that statue, you better be careful, because this is very much alive today, and this is what the institution needs to be struggling against. So I'm for these statues and these symbols to be a scarlet letter of shame that tells us day to day where we were in the past and how that past is influencing the present and where we need to go in the future to make sure we don't fall into that past.
Okay, I receive that. What are your thoughts then about, because again, I receive that and I hear that. I want to challenge you a little bit, though, around how do we ensure that there will still be an assumption around responsibility? Because it's so easy, and we've seen this. We've seen how easy it is for folks to be lulled into comfortability again. So okay. How can we insist?
So let me ask you this. So if you were to walk down San Jacinto, headed towards Dean Keaton, you would see on your right an old dorm off into back behind the trees and all that kind of thing. And you would see on the front there something that says Creekside. And you keep right on walking. Wow, this is wonderful. The Walleye Creek is right here. All these nice old trees. That's a nice brick-looking building and all that kind of thing. Creekside, innocuous and all that. That dorm, up until 10 years ago, was named William Simpkins Dorm. Who was Simpkins? Simpkins was probably the person who shot the first bullet or first shot of the Civil War, right? And where was it? Fort Sumter, or wherever it is, in South Carolina. He also was a colonel in the Confederate Army. He also was the founder with his brother of the Florida Ku Klux Klan. He was a Grand Dragon of the Ku Klux Klan, and he was someone who every Thanksgiving evening for probably 2 decades gave a presentation to the assembled students and faculty of the university in which he glorified the Ku Klux Klan and talked about his role in beating black people. Now, when you walk down there now, right, that's been sanitized. There is no reminder of what that was about. Whereas if we had kept the name and put something in there that told you that, Skylar, you would know that your work in terms of fighting racism is still not done, because the folks who named that building after him named it in 1954. Within a month after in fact, it was the dean of the law school who named that dorm in 1954 after a Grand Dragon, the Ku Klux Klan, in the teeth of Brown versus Board of Education. So that tells you that there's still a lot of work for us to do, to get done. And it tells you that the white students who want to say that we're innocent of that past and still are marching through it with their white privilege, now they don't have to confront that. They walk through it to bucolic scene.
Point taken. Absolutely. How do you...
And that's what the racial geography tour is about.
Right.
Because, before the racial geography tour, there are many people who would walk through this, the campus and not have any idea of the racial past and how the racial, or begin to contemplate how the racial past impacts us today.
Right.
And by taking those things down, it's the same thing as not having been enlightened about them standing there before.
Right.
No different.
I receive that. I think what I'm hearing you saying is essentially by removing them, we also remove with them the opportunity to educate and also encourage further interrogation around the responsibility that we're saying one must have to work towards eliminating.
I'm also saying by doing that, we stand in danger of absolving a racist institution of its racist past.
Gotcha. No, that makes sense. That makes perfect sense. And it's interesting that you were able to conceptualize almost through happenstance. It sounded like, based on the history that you shared, it started as folks coming to visit who were aghast at seeing all of this almost not just a memorialization of the Confederacy, but a mourning of the Confederacy lost and what could have been. And I've had very similar experiences. Right. People don't understand that who aren't from here.
Just to put this in perspective, it's not just almost. This is the largest lost cause commemoration in the country on any university campus. The largest, the single largest, right? Mm-hmm. And why is that? Because the richest Confederate of the university was a regent and has his name all over everything, right? So this is not just any lost cause memorialization. This is the lost cause memorialization on any campus. Right. This is it. What does that tell you about the University of Texas? University of Texas students think, well, it's all about the Longhorns and this, that, and the other thing. But that's an attempt to clean up. It doesn't really do the job because there's all kinds of problems with that. But that's an attempt to clean up the fact that this was and in many ways continues to be a neo-Confederate university. So one of the things that the racial geography tour starts out with this is, do you know where you are? And where you are is you're on the campus of a neo-Confederate university.
I would love for you to say that again, neo-Confederate university. I think it's so important because language is important. The same way that place and space is important, naming things is important, calling them by name. And again, the resistance to this has been, it's been incredible. It's just saying things aloud. So I cannot even imagine the scathing tones and sentiments that are provoked by saying neo-Confederate institution or neo-Confederate university, because even naming things like white supremacy, find folks clutching their pearls, gasping for air, just feeling very abashed around having those conversations. So when we say things like, this is a neo-Confederate university, do you think that that can advance reconciliation with the Black community in Austin specifically, who was largely displaced as a consequence of the institution being erected in the buildings that make up the institution being erected in that place? Do you think that even naming it could help?
I think it helps. I don't think it is what's going to change that relationship. I'm not sure that relationship is ever going to be a relationship of mutuality, basically because the University of Texas is set up not only as a neo-Confederate university, but also as an elite university, right? And eliteness in this country, until kind of anti-Blackness is eliminated, will not include most Black people, right? So I don't see, and I'm not even really looking for redemption and reconciliation, really. I'm old now, but I am looking for truth telling, and I am looking for ways to tell the truth. And I think that in some sense, making sure that people aren't able to take down the stuff that forces them to confront their truth is an issue. So I haven't heard anybody tell me, after looking at the racial geography tour, that I should not say this is a neo-Confederate university. I get hate mail about the Eyes of Texas, is that and the other thing. But once you look at the racial geography tour and you understand who the regents were, you understand who Littlefield was, who's got a house up there, you understand what the statues were and this, that, and the other thing, you can't come out of that and say this is not a neo-Confederate university. You can't.
Right. Because it's the stories of the past and thus history.
On the other hand, if you were just to walk that by Creekside and that's all you saw the university, what is there to tell you it's a neo-Confederate university?
Excellent point. Talk to me about what happened. You said something really important, and at the same time, I think it's real. As painful as it is to acknowledge, it's also, I think, very real. That reconciliation may not be possible, and it's not around the sentimentality of reconciliation. And it's about the fact, to your eloquent point, that as long as elitism is cloaked in anti-Blackness at its anchoring of what determines one to be an elite and have a sense of belonging, to belong in a space, it might not ever happen. That's hard to hear. But I don't necessarily disagree. What happened to Black folk as a consequence of UT Austin being constructed in that space? Can you talk to us a little bit about that history? Because it's so interesting. I've talked with community members, and I can't tell you how often I've heard Black members of the Austin community say they've never even set foot on the campus, even if they live a few blocks away. They've never set foot on the campus. They never want to set foot on the campus. They don't feel welcomed, or feel that it's a welcoming space. What is the lesser told story of the displacement of Black folks around the construction of UT Austin?
Well, UT Austin was built after the time of Reconstruction, and it was basically built in an area which was an area of refuge for Black people. Because Central Austin was mostly below or south of the Capitol building. And this area was a hinterland. It was farmland and this, that, and the other thing. So 1865 hits, and there were people from actually all around the South, Black people all around the South, who came to Austin, in part because this was more or less the frontier, and, the absolute, depths of anti-Blackness and anti-Black violence was maybe somewhat less out here. But anyway, a bunch of those, folks came from there. And also folks came from the black hinterland of Central Texas to Austin. They, of course, couldn't live in, well, many of them, most of them couldn't live in Central Austin, so they lived in the floodplains of Waller Creek and Shoal Creek. And then a bunch of them lived up here. Waller Creek and Shoal Creek, just north of the campus, more or less come together. And so you have black communities on the east bank of Shoal Creek, and that's Wheatville. And it turns out you have black community, or at least black residential area, on the west side of Waller Creek, and that's now that whole area where the music building is now. The area RLM, we had that big fight across the street from RLM. That speedway there were black folks living there. Up Wichita Street, which is where the psychology building is now. That's all a black residential area. And so what happens when you put in a major economic institution in an area, you get gentrification. And so gentrification happened from early on, so that by the 1970s, you get the last black folks in Wheatville leaving. And probably by the 1920s, you get the last black folks who are living on what's now the UT campus. Again, the psych building, Speedway there, 26th Street, where the music building is. Those folks are long gone, all over in East Austin. So when East Austin folks tell you that they wouldn't step foot on the university campus, many of their predecessors lived on what's now the university campus, or lived at least in West Campus, and had to, for a while there, when they were being displaced, cross from Wheatsville to go to school in East Austin. That painful memory is probably mostly lost, especially now when folks are having to leave East Austin and go to Pflugerville and Manor and all the other places that black folks are going to. So yeah, I understand why black folks don't want to reconcile with the University of Texas, don't think it's possible because of the history, say they'd never, set foot on the campus. But in point of fact, the campus is built to a certain extent on black land. So, there's indigenous land acknowledgements, which we probably have to do, but there probably should be some black land acknowledgements in terms of both West Campus and this and the university, in terms of the fact that we're living on lands that black folks used to own, not just occupy.
But own. Interesting. Not unlike Central Park.
Factoid that I just found out the other day. The first black person to live in Austin came as an enslaved person in 1839. Her name was Mahala Murchison. She came Mahala Murchison Strain. Right? She came as probably a 13-year-old. The record books say 10, but I think she was probably a 13-year-old servant, enslaved servant. She lived for almost 30 years on Speedway and 26th, right across the street from the RLM building, right where the neural sciences building is right down today, right there. She's the first black person in Austin. Now, we've got a mansion in Littlefield that's still up, and we venerate and all that kind of thing. Where's the veneration for the house of the first black person to come to Austin? It's under, 600 feet of concrete on the corner of 26th. Well, it's not 26 now. Dean Keaton and Speedway, across the street from a building named after a racist mathematician. That's where she lived.
So what can we do to advance not only awareness and knowledge, but action around that? To your very point, that there are clear acknowledgments around the lost cause. And again, this nostalgia and romantic longing for what could have been with Confederacy. How do we then activate around, at the same time, memorializing the loss of an indigenous life and the displacement of indigenous communities, and also black folk? And I was paralleling that to another factoid that I learned about rather recently, just a few months ago, about black folks who were displaced in Central Park in New York City. And it harkens back to the "we didn't land on Plymouth Rock, Plymouth Rock landed on us" sentiment. But I mean, there are all these examples that are becoming more well known and that are clearly documented, but still it just gets lost with the sentiment of, oh, here's something that happened. How sad. I've not heard of in the same, and again, we have the New York connection. So I remember when the burial ground was found in the financial district. So there are all these, there's evidence of the literal burial of history.
Yeah.
In the Black experience.
Part of it has to do with, I've got 2 minutes left. So part of it has to do with the white notion that before they arrived, there was nothing there. Right? So the University of Texas literally believes that before the University of Texas plopped down here, there was nothing here. All right. So the first thing is to acknowledge, well, yeah, there was stuff here, both indigenous and Black people. The next thing is, I think it's two things that we need to do. We need to do some history and teaching in order to commemorate these histories and memories that have been silenced, right? So the history of Mahala Murchison Strain has been silenced. We need to resurrect her voice, her image, and not just her, the other folks who are there. So that's one thing. But the other thing is, we need to do the work on the institutions to deal with the structural racism and patriarchy upon which these institutions are built, right? And that's really the only way to undermine the history which has created the abominations that we're now telling the story of.
Thank you so much, Dr. Gordon. I know we are talking, and again, I want to thank you for acknowledging so much. This is chock full of good stuff. We could have gone much longer than an hour, but I mean, and I encourage everyone. We will include a link to the racial geography tour that was referenced on our website as well as our YouTube channel, so that folks can click and visit even in the midst of a pandemic. And hopefully when we do come out of the pandemic space that we're currently living in, you will sign up for the in-person experience, because it is an experience. Thank you so much, Dr. Gordon. The Calaboose African American History Museum thanks you as well, and we look forward to reconnecting again. Please enjoy your day. Thank you.
It's been a pleasure. Take care.
Bye-bye.